The Juilliard Public Forum, as we are calling it, is a way for us to bring together thinkers and leaders in various fields to engage in important conversations about America's social, cultural, and political systems. This afternoon, we plan to address the intertwined nature of artistry, empathy, character development, and diplomacy. I'd like to thank the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of Tufts University, one of my alma maters, for their collaboration in envisioning and organizing this program, and to welcome all the Fletcher alumni who are in the audience this evening. Now I'd like to invite to the stage two exceptional individuals. Please welcome Admiral James Stavridis, the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of Tufts University, and New York Times columnist David Brooks. Wonderful to have both of you here.
Thank you.
We've been looking forward to this for many, many times. A few details that you already know, I think, about, but if I could just address quickly, you have full biographies in the program, but Admiral James Stavridis has held the position of Dean of the Fletcher School for nearly 3 years now, and prior to this post, Admiral Stavridis spent over 30 years in the United States Navy, achieving the rank of 4-star Admiral, and 4 of those years as the 16th Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, overseeing operations in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, the Balkans, and the coast of Africa. David Brooks has been a distinguished op-ed columnist for the New York Times since 2003. He's a commentator on the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. Wonderful to have both of you here. At first blush, of course, it might seem a little strange to you out here to what the three of us have in common: a journalist, an admiral, and an arts educator. And yet we have a shared goal, which is how can we develop knowledgeable and empathetic leaders and world citizens? So in the time ahead, we'll explore the intersection of politics, the arts, and the human experience. And over the past few months, I've been thinking, for obvious reasons, if I may say so, about what our world would feel like without empathy, without civility, respect, and a sense of common good in our leaders. So David, you've written widely about this, specifically on the notions of character, and of course in the New York Times. In your recent book, though, The Road to Character, you really delve into it quite deeply. Could you tell us a bit about what you mean by character and what role it plays in leadership?
Okay, first I want to apologize for not wearing a tie. I thought, hey, I'm coming to Juilliard, they'll be in like leotards and a beret, I can get away with it, so sorry. Second, how much I'm looking forward to this. I actually did a theater panel about 7 years ago, which had this pivotal effect on my life. I come from Washington, D.C. I was living then, which is the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And I did a panel at the Public Theater downtown with Anne Hathaway and Bill Irwin, who's this great clown. And before the panel, we were backstage and we did this big group hug. It was like a whole theater experience. And then they had tissues on stage in case we started crying, which is not what we do in Washington. And then we got finished and it was another group hug. And so I thought, I gotta come to New York more and sort of get my emotions out. So to answer your question, I'll just list 5 traits where I think character intersects with character. With leadership. The first is humility, which I think is the queen of the virtues. And humility is not thinking lowly of yourself, it's radical self-awareness from a position of other-centeredness. That's the ability to step outside yourself and to look inside yourself and to look at yourself with extreme accuracy. The second is the self-confrontation. A great leader has the capacity to see his or her core weakness and to combat against it every day. So in the case of the military, Dwight Eisenhower's core weakness was he was a man of great temper and rage. Right. And he knew he couldn't lead from that position, so he created this false persona of country club garrulousness and optimism. And that was not natural, that was a creation. The third is the capacity to make deep commitments to things. And to me, a commitment is the falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters, and the ability to stay locked into some commitment for just a long time. The fourth is beauty, a capacity for beauty. And to me, moral senses are all aesthetic senses. They hit us as the way the arts hit us. And so the capacity to perceive the beautiful is the capacity to desire the right things. There's this famous Plato passage from the Symposium who says young people should be confronted with beauty. And first they'll like the beautiful form of somebody of the opposite sex or their own sex, whatever. But then that love of that beauty will turn into a love of ideas, which is a higher beauty. And then that will turn into a love of justice, which the well-governed community, which is a yet higher beauty. And then that will turn into a love of the beauty to which nothing can be added and nothing can be subtracted, which is transcendent beauty. And so the capacity for that is part of desiring the highest things. And then the final thing I'll mention, and here I'm coming back to my emotional avoidance and emotional openness, is love. The capacity to be deeply loving. And so there was a study I read recently of soldiers in World War II in the Army. They were all drafted. Some stayed privates. Some rose into high rank of major or whatever. And they did a study after the war, what explained why some men rose and some didn't. And they thought it might be IQ, but there was no correlation. They thought it might be social status, no correlation. Physical bravery, no correlation. The biggest correlation was relationship with mother. And that the people who received great floods of love and joy from their mother were capable of giving it to their men. And so even in the case like the military, something which is hard and seems disciplined, the capacity for love and to be soft and squishy is a great leadership capacity.
Absolutely.
Wow, okay. And Jim, also with your book, one of your many books, The Accidental Admiral, which is a memoir of your leadership and life lessons, you put it that you've been looking at things like smart power, which is a mixture of soft power and hard power, and I think talked about that a little bit last year when we had the honor of having you here about cultural diplomacy and ways of ideologically dealing with various cultures in a sensitive way. And also open source security, you've spoken of a lot, international interagency collaborations for strategic communication. So you've often talked about, if I may say, instead of building walls, you talk of building bridges. Another germane point, I suppose, these days. But how do you, you're now in charge of a school, you were in charge of an enormous military operation. How do you educate leaders who will have this sense of collaboration and adaptive capacity, and maybe, as David said, the sense of I suppose, hardness and softness at the same time?
Well, first I want to apologize for wearing a tie. I do want to pick up David's points, which I think are spot on. And I was telling David I spoke to about 600 high school students from all around the country, the 4-H club, if you remember the 4 H's. And the one book I recommended to them was David's, The Road to Character. It's quite a good book. But I want to pick up on that last virtue of love and make the point that it is part of the military culture. And if you walk back to the ancient Greeks, and I'm Greek American, so I'm allowed to use this example. Go back to a wonderful novel, by the way, called Gates of Fire, which is about the stand of the Greeks against the Persians at the Gates of Fire, at Thermopylae, over 2,000 years ago. And one of the lines that comes out of that is that in battle, the opposite of fear is not courage. The opposite of fear is love. It's love for those with whom you have entered this fight. It is the love you carry into the world, and it is love of your nation. Those, I think, are fundamental values in the military, and they translate pretty well. So to your excellent question about hard power and soft power, which I think picks this up as well, I would not want to confuse anybody with the idea that we live in a world where we can never use hard power, nor should we ever use hard power. Let's face it, we are not going to negotiate a solution to the Islamic State. They're psychopathic thugs. You need hard power at the front end of an operation like that. But the real question is to create security in the 21st century. Is hard power sufficient? It is not. It's necessary at times, but the long game is in the soft power side. It's creating the right conditions and opportunities and education, perhaps above all. Those are the most important bridges we can build. If you look back on the 20th century, and I say this as a security professional, the 20th century was a complete failure of security. 60 million people died in 2 epic world wars. And then we almost blew up the planet in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Huge failure of security. Why? Because in the 20th century, we tried to create security by building walls. Maginot Line, Schlieffen Plan, Iron Curtain, Bamboo Curtain, most iconically the Berlin Wall. Walls will not create security in the 21st century. You do have to build bridges. And the qualities David talks about are central to doing that, both at a personal level and I would argue at a national and international level as well.
You know, here at Juilliard, of course, we have about 850 extraordinary young artists who are actors, dancers, and musicians. And I teach a course called the American Society of the Arts. And for that small group of students, we talk about the relevance of being an artist within a world of terrorism, of war, of refugees. And you know, the question of whether the arts really matter in this severe context. So, David, perhaps I'll just start with you. I mean, you recently wrote something, if I may quote you, that says, "By arousing the senses, beauty arouses through the spirit. A person who has appreciated physical grace may have a finer sense of how to move with graciousness through the tribulations of life. A person who has appreciated the Pietà has a greater capacity for empathy, a more refined sense of the different forms of sadness, and a wider awareness of the repertoire of emotions." In this sense, can artistic engagement develop stronger leaders and citizens, or is this just way too soft for what we're talking about in the 21st century?
Well, that's my answer right there. You just read it.
Yeah, right.
No, you know, I do think, I have mixed emotions about artistic engagement in politics. And so I spend a lot of my time as a political pundit, and when I confront artists who want to be engaged in politically, I always think, why do you want to come down to my level? Because there's a great couplet from Samuel Johnson, "Of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure." And that's about the limits of politics. Now, politics has, believe me, I think it's very important. I dedicate a lot of my life to it, but it has limits. The things that really shape society are pre-political. And they're about the emotional perceptions, they're about the conditions that, about relationships between people and the quality of relationships. And those are shaped powerfully by the arts. And so, like I said, like I wrote there, what the arts can do is educate your emotions. A, so you desire the right things, and B, so you're subtle and sensitive in your capacity for desiring. We have a sense that the emotions are opposite to reason, but there's a guy named Antonio Damasio at USC who studies people with brain lesions and they can't process emotion. And such people are not super smart Mr. Spocks, they can't make decisions. There was one of Damasio's patients, he would come back every week, and he could not process emotions. He knew what he was supposed to feel, he just didn't feel anything. And so Damasio said to him, "Do you want to come back next Tuesday or Wednesday?" And the guy spent 30 minutes trying to recite, well, Tuesday would be good for this, but Wednesday would be good for this, Tuesday would be good for this, Wednesday bad. He couldn't make a decision. And that's because what the emotions do is their evaluation mechanisms. They assign value to things. And the more subtle your emotions are, the more subtle your valuations of what you want and what you don't want. And so I think part of that is innate, but most of it is trained. And I think artistic experience and living through other people's artistic experiences is part of the things that train the emotions. And so to start right at the top, 60 Minutes did an interview with Taylor Swift. And they asked her about sadness. And she said, well, I know, I'm paraphrasing here, I know of about 13 kinds of sadness. There's the kind when your boyfriend dumps you and she plays a little song, that's what that sadness. There's when your parents are mean to you, that's what that sadness sounds like. When your dog dies, that's what that sadness. And she's like an expert in sadness. And she can communicate that through her music, and I think we learn that. And then the final thing I'll say is one of the things, especially the narrative arts, but I think also the musical and theatrical arts do, is refine your capacity to see. And we think that seeing is obvious, you just look out and see the world, but the capacity to see clearly is a refined skill. There's a 19th century art historian named John Ruskin who said that the more I think of it, the more I realize that the capacity to see clearly and explain what you saw in a simple way is the central fact of life. That there are thousands of people who can speak for one who can think, but there are thousands who can think for one who can see. And so you think about the way George Orwell saw the world, or Tolstoy. There's just a clarity of sight there that has to be practiced.
Can I pick up on a thought with
Absolutely,
that?
yeah.
Agreeing with that completely, I'll see you all those good points, and I'll raise you two that I think are important in terms of the arts and my world, both as previously as a senior military officer and currently as the dean of a graduate school of international relations. One is the near universality of many of the performing arts. Now that's not uniform, but the fact that we admire music, we admire playwrights, we loved that presentation we just heard before coming out on stage. The more we see each other as humans who participate and engage in the arts, the more we, in my view, are able to at least conceive of empathy, to conceive of similarity, to conceive of stepping across and having a conversation with the other, because the other appreciates the arts. The second point I would make is a more prosaic one, which is the kind of cultural exchanges that can be generated, I think are important, and they build. And so because we send an orchestra to Pyongyang, I don't think we're suddenly going to see foreign policy shift. But I think over time, those kind of cultural exchanges matter in a prosaic way, as a way diplomats can exercise a tool of statecraft, and they're enjoyable. See paragraph 1 on the empathy gathering aspects of this. And I'll conclude with just a practical example, if I could. We were in the president's office earlier, and we saw Louisville Slugger baseball bat up there from Keith Hernandez. We should remember that sports played at a very high level is a performing art, in my view. And once upon a time, when I was, prior to being the European leader of military operations, I had charge of Latin America and the Caribbean. And we were seeking ways to portray the United States in a different way in Latin America and the Caribbean, where we are often perceived correctly as an imperial power that has invaded many times. We've invaded countries in Latin America and the Caribbean dozens of times. So instead of sending plane loads and shiploads of troops down there, we sent baseball players. They were military petty officers and sergeants and very good athletes who had played at an intercollegiate level, but we were able to send them down to put on clinics, to work with young children, and put a very different face on the military. That's soft power. And I think the arts, both sports and all the performing arts that are so magnificent here at Juilliard, can be part of that in a kind of prosaic way.
Well, let me follow up with both of you. And particularly, you had mentioned ISIL and the issue of their terrorism, and
Right.
and that really that's only a response that can be stopped through military means. But below that, there is a good deal of discussion about trying to show how American culture does work in its best ways and how we can get those messages out. I personally don't think the State Department has had an extraordinary track record of doing that, unfortunately. But we've also heard within the public forums that have been taking place with the primaries the absolute opposite, carpet bombing and asking or coming up with policies in which individuals are not allowed in the United States. How do we address this intelligently in a way that can put some rationality behind it? Because after all of these is said and done, and there is an election, we're going to have to go on with some governing.
Well, in my view, if somebody wrote a really stern column in the New York Times against Donald Trump, he would probably collapse.
Very good, okay.
No, it's disheartening. What's happening, and I think partly for this reason. I miss the Trump phenomenon entirely, and I'm remorseful about that. That I just didn't understand America. I knew the social segmentation was such that people were angry, pissed off, apolitical. I didn't think they'd think that Donald Trump was the solution, and I've got to figure out how I missed this gigantic story. But to me, what's remarkable about the Trump phenomenon in regards to this institution is that it's a revolution in manners more than a revolution in policy. The guy has no policy, he doesn't understand policy, except for getting rid of NATO, but I'm surprised he's heard of it. Maybe we should get rid of NATO, I don't know. But it's a revolution in manners, and to me the key moment was in the first Republican debate. He'd already insulted Carly Fiorina's face, if you remember, and he looked at Rand Paul and said, "I'm not going to insult your looks, but I got a lot to work with there." And so that was a moment when all the normal ways you talk in a political debate, all the taboos fell away. And suddenly we're in a new world, and the reason we have rules of civility and rules of conversation is so we can talk to each other across differences. And when you take away those rules, the normal standards of politeness, it's just dog eat dog. And so he immediately turned it into a dog eat dog professional wrestling context. And then I wrote this in today's column. He is strangely loveless in his worldview. There's not a lot of reciprocity, there's not a lot of love, there's not a lot of trust. There's just winners and losers, conquerors and conquered. And the relationships between the genders is one of conquerors and conquered. And men are the conquerors and women are the conquered. And so the misogyny there is also of a piece of someone who lives in a universe that is entirely loveless. And so what Trump represents is this stripping away of all the civilization of refinement that has been slowly built up in our larger culture and was existing in our political culture. And that's why I think he's such a menace. And for Republicans, the ones who, when he becomes the nominee, I just don't think it's morally right to support him. Someone who talks about women, for example, in this way, he's not a normal candidate, he's something abnormal and deeply, subversively destructive of our civilization. And I want you to know, I'm brave enough to say that on the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
Hard to top that. I'll simply say, if you dropped a plumb line from our first president, George Washington, to today's campaigns, it's awfully hard to see the straightness of that line. And by the way, to the point about civility, if you haven't read it since you were in grammar school, go back and reread George Washington's Rules of Civility. It's a small pamphlet-like book that he wrote on this precise topic. And it echoes loudly in its irony today. And that's the tragedy. We ought to also remember a point I've been trying to make a lot these days in this winter of our political discontent. We ought to look in the mirror. We ought to recognize that, as Ross Perot said, we're the owners of this country. Why don't we fix it? And de Tocqueville, who wrote magnificently about democracy, title of the book, On Democracy, in the 1840s, largely laudatory account of democracy, but his cautionary note was that the tragedy of democracy is that in the end you will elect the government you deserve. We ought to contemplate that and look in the mirror and fix it. And that is not beyond our grasp as citizens of this country.
Well, actually, a segue to that is something I want to read you. from a new report that just came out from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that's called The Heart of the Matter, and it deals with the importance of the study of humanities and social sciences for the future of our nation. And then I'd appreciate if you both comment on this short paragraph as to how we can get this better, because this is definitely an issue. This is the introduction to the report. It reads, "Who will lead America into a bright future? Citizens who are educated in the broadest possible sense so that they can participate in their own governance and engage with the world. An adaptable and creative workforce, experts in national security, equipped with the cultural understanding, knowledge of social dynamics, and language proficiency to lead our foreign service and military through complex global conflicts. Elected officials and a broader public who exercise civil political discourse founded on an appreciation of the ways our differences and commonalities have shaped our rich history. We must prepare the next generation to be these future leaders." Where have we gone wrong? Have we gone wrong? Are the roots uprooted entirely? Or, within the context of the arts, which is what we're all about here at Juilliard, we know that the arts are not taught the way they were taught in the 1950s and 60s in public schools around the nation. And so we are literally reaping what we have sown in that area, and that's why there are audiences who are getting older and perhaps smaller audiences who know less about what the art's all about. But it's perhaps the same thing with our Constitution, with our traditions.
So I was on the commission that wrote that report. And I can tell you...
Maybe you wrote this?
Of course.
I didn't write that. I can tell you it's possibly the most boring report ever issued by a commission in the history. And I actually didn't like it. So I have issues with this. And partly it's arguing for the humanities because it'll make more employable college graduates and a better society. And that's not, to me, why we come to the theater or why we listen to music. It's not for public good. It's for something more important, which is the formation of the inner spirit. And we do it because it's fun. And to turn the arts into a utilitarian outer thing when it should be a fun inner thing and a deeply pleasurable thing is to give away the game, in my view. The reason the humanities are declining as a major in colleges is because even when I went to college, my English teachers and my Western Civ teachers thought these books hold the magic keys to the kingdom of truth, and they will make you a better person, and you'll get deep pleasure out of it. And now, if you turn everything into a social problem, you've given away the turf, which are the core turf of the humanity, which is what goes on in the spirit and the soul and the heart. And so, you know, I can think of all sorts of examples of people I know who are deeply immersed in the humanities. Let's pick out Yo-Yo Ma. If anybody knows him, he's a guy who just radiates joy. He's this weird mixture of extreme wisdom and extreme childlikeness. And I think it's because he just takes innate, simple pleasure, but deep pleasure in music. And that music infuses him with a sort of gracefulness. And I meet kids, I go over to a friend's house every Thursday night, and her kids are 17-year-old African-American kids with horrible backgrounds, but they're all into music, and they're DJs, and a couple are poets, and two are painters. And they found their identity and their joy in that. And so if we start thinking of the arts as sort of broccoli for social improvement, we've sort of taken away the fun of it. And if you take away the fun of it, you're taking away the core of it.
I'm going to make the case that it can be a bit of both, that you can enjoy it deeply. It's kind of like broccoli with olive oil and lemon that's been roasted and really is actually really good. I think the arts work as something delicious and wonderful as you've categorized it. I think also the arts, and here I'm speaking of the arts very broadly, so again back to not only performance and dance and opera and music, but theater and fiction and sports, those are the arts of life. I think they do make you a better citizen and a more complete person. And perhaps it's partly the discipline of them, partly it's the empathy of it, the connectivity it makes for you. And I think also in that, if I remember the paragraph well, I'm not sure I remember every word after 30 whole seconds, but were languages in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe strongly in the study of languages. I think they have both an internal component that's extremely enjoyable, at least for me and for others that I know, but they also allow you to build bridges. And again, where we get into trouble, both in our personal lives and in our national life, in our international world, is when we try and build walls around ourselves. And I think the arts are a kind of a bridge that can help connect us. So I agree with David, but I think there's goodness at both ends of that argument.
Can I be a little negative here? So I just wrote this book where I have all these characters who exemplify good character, and they were all pathetic at age 20, but kind of magnificent by age 70. They really built themselves into something. And in the military, it was not hard to find people to fit this category. And the two I chose are obvious, but George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower. And then I wanted to have a writer. And so I said, let me find a writer with really good character. And that was a multi-year search. Because they tend to be self-absorbed and narcissistic, and they're often rotten to the people around them. I was going to do Bernard Malamud, who seems to have been a good guy. I settled on George Eliot just because she went through some turmoil and really was capable of amazingly strong love. But sometimes the people who perform the best arts are the rottenest human beings. And then the other phenomenon you see, and there's a poet up at Yale named Christian Wyman who writes about this, there's sometimes a quality of self-emptying that comes from being a performing artist. That you give it all away and there's a dryness inside. And everyone gets something out of it except you. And so as a poet, he describes how sometimes the expression of poetry leads to just an emptiness within because you're just the vehicle for something that's going through you. And so I firmly believe the arts improve people, but you wouldn't know it when you meet a lot of artists sometimes.
Well,
that's about as
I think
negative as you can get.
you could say that about Wagner and Beethoven and not be too far afield. I mean, but just going back to the point that both of you were making, from my perspective, I suppose one could argue, as the president of Juilliard, that art for art's sake is the way to go. And I think a little bit of what you're saying is that direction. But on the other side, I think that especially in 21st century America and the K through 12 systems that we have around the country, there's such a lack of arts education. I mean, there are hot spots. I always tell the story, you could go up Columbus Avenue here on the west side, and at 73rd Street is a elementary school that has one of the greatest music programs you've ever seen. And you go up to 80th Street and there's nothing. And that doesn't work in a public education system of 1.1 million children in New York City. So what can we do to bring that back, to convince politicians? And I've been looking at social emotional learning, which I think you've been writing about too, or I guess they told me that if you're a liberal, it's social emotional learning, and if you're a conservative, it's character building. But either way, it's the ideas of diligence, resiliency, focus, joy in the experience. And one great way of matching that with academic subjects is music and dance and drama instruction, where you work on cooperative efforts, you work on seeing how other people respond to your own actions. So I'm still trying to find some hook to get music back and drama and dance back into the school systems of New York City, at least, and that seems to be a way to go. So I don't think it'll diminish the art.
Yeah. I having a flashback memory, I went to a conference that's called CASEL, the Social and Emotional Learning Conference, and this is a very huggy group of people. And so we had to get up and we had to turn to the person who happened to be seated next to us, who we probably didn't know, and put our arms around them and go nose to nose with this complete stranger. And so Well, that was harsh. That was a tough moment for me. But I will say that
Was it all that huggy? No, no.
there was a lot of
okay.
staring into each other's eyes. There was a lot of that. Where I get off? But I will say two things. I was in Sacramento, California, with the superintendent of schools there, and she told me that the reason kids stay in school is the ABCs: athletics, band, and cheerleading. And I do think there are a lot of students who do not think in normal academic terms, and they need some reason to come to school. And those things, and the arts are a different way of processing reality. And I'm sort of involved in an organization called Turnaround Arts, which basically takes, and the story I just heard this morning was in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the worst school in Bridgeport. It looked like a military fortress with magnetometers and 5 big security guards who were basically running the school because they were afraid of discipline. And a new principal came in, took away the magnetometers, fired the 5 security guards, and hired 5 arts educators. And they'd had this amazing effect right away because people actually had something positive to look forward to, as well as painting the school. So there's actually a lot of verifiable evidence that these kinds of turnarounds do work if you give people a desire to come to school and something to like,
Yeah.
rather than something to fear.
Well, let me ask one last question, and then we're going to the audience for their questions. And I'm going to go back to the general election, if you don't mind. You've touched upon it already, but in each way, you've been extraordinary leaders around the world representing the values of the United States. What's the scenario that you see coming down the pike, and how do we deal with it?
I think we've had a pretty good riff on the putative Republican nominee. I'm a recently retired military officer, a senior one. I'm apolitical. I'm a registered independent. I'm not here to endorse anybody, but I will tell you a couple of qualities that I have admired in people that I think are good leaders around the world. And it kind of lines up, frankly, with the number of things David has said. First of all, I think a leader needs to be calm. The ultimate outcome of good leadership is bringing order out of chaos. Order out of chaos. That means if you lose your temper, if you react too quickly, if you lead the nation into war when the first thing that crosses your desk catches your fancy, you move too fast. That's dangerous. And so I'm looking for a leader with balance and temperament. Secondly, I think I'm going to sign up with humility, someone who's not an overweening ego. Thirdly, look at the team. Look at the team. And each of these candidates in every election, you can start to see the shape of who's around them. I think that's extremely revealing and important. And fourthly, I look for somebody who has a sense of humor. Now, we haven't talked a lot about it, although I think we've exhibited a little here, but I think the ability to see the humor in life, to realize that things are not going to go perfectly, there's a news flash, and you can laugh a bit and move on. There are times when things are, in fact, deadly serious, but so often in life, tied to that humility is that ability to step back and sense a way to lighten the atmosphere. I think good leaders do that as well. When you put all that together, you have to ask yourself, does the system we have today present us with candidates who provide those kind of qualities? Again, we ought to ask ourselves if we're satisfied with that system.
First, let me start off on that same, the one note that the gradualism and incrementalism is something I believe in. Another Greek friend of mine, Thucydides, wrote that in politics, the lows are lower than the highs are high.
Yes.
That when you screw up, you really screw up. If you do everything great, you move up a little.
Yeah.
And so caution is the watchword. Eisenhower had a phrase, let's make our mistakes slowly.
Yeah.
And he always sort of felt his way in. And one of the speeches I love of Eisenhower's is his farewell speech, which used the word balance 19 times. and that his basic view was that politics is a competition between partial truths, between security and freedom, between achievement and equality, and you're just trying to figure out where you are in balance. It's like you're sailing a ship and you're just trying to keep it balanced and go forward. Now, as for where I think the country's headed, first of all, I'll do a sort of reverse Oreo, I guess. So first, on the good side, it's really hard to think of a country better positioned for the 21st century than the US. I still think you look at our education system, you look at the creativity of our economy, you look at our capital markets, you look at the magnet we are for talent, and you look around the world at all the other countries, none of them are quite as well positioned. And so that's a basic fact. Then the dark side is that we were talking about this backstage, the world is darkening. The Freedom House rates democracies, whether they're moving toward democracy or against freedom. And for the last 8 years, the world has been moving significantly away from freedom and democracy. Authoritarianism is on the rise, ethnic nationalism is on the rise, religious fundamentalism is on the rise. I think all because of structural flaws in the global economy, which don't reward work with assets. And so that's the negative side. The positive side is we all get to work with young people. And if you want to feel good about the country, go out drinking with a bunch of 21-year-olds. Not 20, 21. That gets you thrown in jail. But, and so all the social indicators that went south in the 60s are now moving in the right direction. So teenage violence is down, teenage suicide is down, pregnancy is down by a third, abortion rates are down by a third, domestic violence is down. The young people my joke is when I teach at Yale, I ask them, what are you doing in spring break? It's like, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers. They're all doing this amazing stuff. And they're all going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 10 years. But right now, they're just leading to a period of general social repair, and so it's fun to be around them.
Yeah, and the other point we were making backstage, we are all cognizant of this kind of darkening and the rise of authoritarian regimes, exactly right. We ought to also put things in perspective and think about what this conversation would have looked like in 1916 if we were seated on this stage having this conversation. The world was engaged in the center of the First World War. On this day, 17,000 people would have been killed in battles in Central Europe in that day. We have seen many challenges in our current times, but I think we are the long throw here. I think we're improving. It's a terrific book by Pinker, Our Better Angels, looks at this as well. So in the midst of all this, I like to think a place like Juilliard can sharpen the good side of what David correctly points out. And I'm not a triumphalist for the United States, but I am an optimist about this country.
Thank you. You've both been wonderful. And let's open to some questions. There are two of my colleagues here on either side with a microphone. And so if you could just raise your hand and we'll find you and speak into the microphone clearly.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much to the three of you for being here, and thank you for the conversation. My question comes from things that I've been wrestling with as a musician as I think about next steps. One of the themes that emerged a number of times from this conversation was how we can, particularly through the arts and using the arts, how we can build bridges rather than barriers. One of the areas of growing barriers or distance between people in our country right now, as you know, is inequality. We're seeing levels of wealth and income inequality that we have not seen in 100 years, since the early 1900s. This factors into many areas of life, including, probably in some way, factors into, for instance, the rise of Donald Trump and some of the anger behind that. At the same time, there seems to be a widespread perception, perhaps more now even than 50 years ago, that much of what we do at the school, classical music, I'm a classical musician, for instance, is an art form for the privileged few. As a musician, of course, I vehemently reject that notion, but I still recognize it as a widespread perception. So my question is, what do you feel that we can and should be doing as artists and as people who care about the arts to make sure that our art really is for everyone, so that, as Mr. Brooks said, all might be confronted by beauty through what we do, both in concrete, practical terms. I mean, on that note, in concrete, practical terms, across the street, at the Met, ticket prices are, for instance, prohibitive for many people. Mozart, in his later years, would not have been able to see his own operas performed. So both in concrete, practical terms, how do we address this? And also in terms of broader perceptions about the arts, how do we really make sure that the art is for everyone? Thank you.
I think that's actually a question for you, Mr.
Well,
President.
I'll start off. Jean-Luc is a wonderful pianist in our master's program. First of all, in terms of elitist experience, 91% of the students at the Juilliard School, and schools like Juilliard around the country, but 91% qualify for federal financial aid this year. So that means that they do not come from families with significant financial resources, quite the contrary. And if you look at other distinguished liberal arts institutions, you'll get a much lower level than a percentage than what happens here. We're not sending off the message well about who the artists really are, I think, and we have to do better in that way. But I think the reason that there's a perception of elitism is exactly as you said, Jean-Luc, that the ticket prices for these events are so high that only people with enormous resources can get there. I think one of the themes that we have at Juilliard is talking about asking artists to function beyond the stage, to take a responsibility after their performances. And this has been happening a good deal through all of the outreach programs, community outreach programs we've had. And it's also happening in schools like Juilliard around the United States as well. So I think what has to happen, though, is that young artists have to have that sense of mission and have to be capable of being articulate in explaining what that mission is to a population that often doesn't really understand what the arts are at all, and in some ways sees it as perhaps even a source of evil doings. And if you go back to the 1989 Mapplethorpe controversy with the National Endowment for the Arts, and I don't think Jesse Helms, the senator from North Carolina, strategically decided to attack the NEA in the way he did, but yet it was one of the most effective attacks on the arts within government parlance in probably the history of the arts and government. So we have to still fight against that perception that the arts are not always a positive element, that they do in some cases, they do represent all sorts of issues that are troubling, and that's what the arts are about, I think. Literature, in music, in dance, in drama, in the visual arts, Picasso and Guernica, these are images that are troubling, but it also tells us about our own humanity, and that's what I think the message has to be.
I should point out Jean-Luc laid down a good foundation at Yale before he came here.
In piano.
One of my best students ever. I guess I would say a couple things. There's a Dorothy Sayers essay, and which she says, when you think when you're doing your art, you want to serve the community. But if you think about trying to serve the community, you'll screw up your art, because you'll be thinking about the audience. And what she says, you want to serve the work. You want to do the best you can for the work. And then if you pay attention to doing the work well, the community will be there for you. And I don't have an art, but I have a craft, I guess, of column writing. And the first 6 months on the job, I was paralyzed by self-doubt. And I got 290,000 emails. I remember I deleted my email box after 6 months, and there were 290,000. and the core message was, Paul Krugman is great, you suck. That was the and it was only when I started asking myself the following question, or stopped asking myself the following question, that I could do, or at least enjoy the job, which was, how am I doing? Once I stopped asking that, I could focus on the stuff I was writing about rather than how I was doing. And I still basically think that the job of somebody who's playing piano or violin or dance is to serve the work first. And Roger Scruton, this great philosopher of culture, says when we communicate these things, we're not necessarily serving our audience, we're serving the culture itself. We're trying to live up to the great things that have been left to us. And as for whether it's affordable or not, obviously I agree, going out into the communities and teaching this stuff. But new technologies, it seems to me, at least provide access.
Yep.
I mean, maybe people can't afford the opera. I can barely afford the opera, but there's YouTube, and you can go to your local movie theater.
Yeah, that's actually the point I was going to make, agreeing entirely that it's a marvelous, priceless, exquisite experience to go over there and be in the house for an opera. I would say so much art is available at relatively low cost through the technologies David mentions, through, I don't know this, but I would guess you have many free events right here that are performing events.
Over 700, yeah.
Over 700. The Kennedy Center every day in Washington, D.C. has a free live performance. I think if you want to fill your life with the arts, you can probably do it on a relatively low cost. The point I think you made that is precisely dead on is the pernicious effect of rising levels of inequality in the country. And that's mirrored globally, and that is unsustainable over time politically. That's really the point to key on.
I didn't expect to do this, but I will disagree with you on this. The nature of young artists is obviously to develop technique and then to go across that bridge to develop artistry. Technique is alone nothing. It's only through communication that you really have art. I find, and I think my colleagues as well, often in a pressure cooker environment like Juilliard, the artists become isolated within the work. And yes, they may serve that art, but it's only, and I've seen this over and over again, when they get into hospitals, hospices, schools, nursing homes, AIDS centers, that they see how the art works in a different context, in a different venue. And it often is revelatory for them. I've seen this over and over again, how the students change in terms of being communicative artists. Because, you know, initially, when you say somebody is talented, a child is talented, and they're 8 years old or something, and they're playing a piece that they shouldn't be able to play at 8 years old, which we see a lot at Juilliard and Opry College. Generally, we're talking about technique. I mean, we're not necessarily saying that they're extraordinary communicative artists. But it's later when that expression comes, and it's better that they forget about getting the right notes and go to the communication. The story of Rubinstein, when he was doing recordings, and he released a recording that had a lot of mistakes in it. And somebody said to him, you know, why are you doing this, maestro? And he said, because the music is so good. You know, and I think that's what artists have to get over. And often, if you take them out of the traditional venue of this stage and put them in a third grade school or a geriatric care unit, they see another part of it. So yeah. I would disagree.
Okay, I'm going to not disagree back, but I'm going to ask you a question because okay. I'm curious. So you're training artists who are at a certain age, who are at the cusp of adult life. And I totally buy that when they're out in the community getting reaction, it changes the way they think of the art as it's more of a form of communication. What about having life experience and suffering? Do you think you need to have gone through that to achieve a level of depth of performance? I'm thinking of for some reason, a Katie Lang version of Hallelujah. If anybody goes, I highly recommend going on YouTube and watching this performance, her first performance in a Canadian awards show. And the depth of the suffering she'd experienced comes filtered out through the music. And presumably, as they get older, that experiences can funnel in and feed into how they perform.
You mean,
what are we expecting of a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old?
Well, I think it was Proust who said that only through suffering do you realize real art. Not that I want our students to suffer, but I do think, especially on the creative side, Many times, I think, a deep introspection about humanity does, in fact, create better art. When you're a performer and you're playing, second bassoon in the New York Philharmonic, I think it's a different type of experience. But I do think that that human introspection that we've been talking about is absolutely necessary for an artist, and I think for a country, if you're, or else everything that we experience, doesn't it seems so superficial. It seems so wrong. It seems so badly thought out. And I think that's one of the experiences of being an artist and teaching others how to be artists, or at least attempt to address the arts. We have some hands here.
Thank you for your well thought out comments. Admiral mentioned the George Washington and his manners. I recall that David Brooks wrote an article about that very same topic about 7, 8 years ago, and there's a reason I remember it, but you talked about hopefully the new president, Barack Obama, could bring that feeling back to our country as a problem solver and produce some better feelings in our country. And we've seen instead a development of more and more narcissism and the fight between different sides of the political environment. And perhaps that's what's created what we have now, where no one feels that we solve problems together. Could any of you, or could you all comment on what do we as citizens, as military people, as journalists, as artists, how do we help our country re-review that, how we solve problems together? That's such a wonderful virtue, and we seem to, on the political level in our country, seem to have lost that. Thank you.
Jim?
I would start by going back to education and the values that we communicate to our children. And that's done partly in our classrooms. It's done, more importantly, in our homes. It's done through exposing our children to real life scenarios and also exposing them to literature and fiction, which allows you to put yourself in a different time and a different place. So education, I think, shaped largely by families, but I think there is a role for our state education systems to do that. Secondly, we should be unafraid to be involved politically, to let our voices be heard, to select candidates who are, in fact, exemplifying the kind of virtues that David has written about so eloquently in The Road to Character. We need to make good choices. Just like we tell our children to make good choices in their lives, we need to make good choices as voters, where we put financial commitment, where we do volunteer work. We need to do that and not become cynical and walk away from it. Those are, I think, the two principal aspects of what has to happen. And then thirdly, all of us need to simply practice the virtue of empathy, to try and put ourselves in the other's position. David Foster Wallace, a brilliant writer who killed himself, another dark, tortured artist, but an extraordinary writer, gave a commencement lecture at the University of Virginia on this subject, on how we feel when we stand in a grocery line and someone ahead of us is slowing us down. And his entire commencement speech was not about follow your dreams, make sure you wear sunscreen, all the cliches and tropes that are normally out there. It was a commencement speech about the internal dialogue we ought to feel. St. Augustine said, "Be kind to all you meet, for you know not what burden they carry." That's a pretty good philosophy. We need to inculcate that. We all have a responsibility to do so.
There's a thing about grocery lines, there's a psychological concept called the fundamental attribution error, which is never ascribe to character that which can be explained by context. And so if you butt into a supermarket line, you think, well, I'm in a hurry, I gotta get home. If somebody else does it, you think, what a jerk. And so we degrade ourselves. I would say two things. One, I do think humility, we keep coming back to it. There certainly has been a rise of self-esteem in this country, of unearned self-esteem. And if anybody knows about that, it's a New York Times columnist. But just two data points that are in my book. In 1950, the high school seniors were asked, are you a very important person? And in 1950, 12% said yes. They were asked a similar question in 1990s, and 80% said yes, I'm a very important person. So, and then the other thing, psychologists have a test they call the narcissism test, where they read you a bunch of statements and then they say, does this apply to you? And their statements like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Or somebody should write a biography of me. Or I like to look at my body. And the mean narcissism score has gone up 30% in the last 20 years. And they do this test all around the world. And in the US, we're number 1. I think Serbia is number 2, and I think Israel's number 3. And with that comes a great confidence in your own ability to know the truth. And all of conversation is based on the idea that you might be wrong, and you might have something to learn from the people you disagree with. And but if you think you know the truth, then what do you need the people you disagree with? The second thing I'd say is social segmentation. There's just a lot more of it. The number of Democrats move to Democratic areas like this one, Republicans move to Sugar Land, Texas. And the number of counties in this country where one party or another has a landslide majority has doubled in a generation. And with that goes this deepening where politics becomes not only a political viewpoint, it becomes a tribal identity. And once it becomes a tribal identity, it's just very hard to compromise. And so another bit of data, in 1970, Americans were asked, would you mind if your son or daughter married somebody of the opposing party? And back then, 5% would mind, and now 40% would mind. And so that's because politics has become tribal. And then if you compromise your politics, suddenly you're compromising your identity, and it's almost dishonor. And so we've got to diminish the importance of politics in this country. I hope if your children or grandchildren come home and say, I want to get married to so-and-so, you don't think, you know, Democrat or Republican. That should not be your first question.
Yeah, and you know, I want to pick up, because we're here with David from the media. I think the segmentation in the media has profoundly influenced this. In other words, if you are a very conservative person, you can get on Fox and listen to that endlessly, or even more to the right, you can get on radio talk shows, and you're self-reinforced. You're not hearing the opposing view. And if you're on the liberal side of the spectrum, maybe you're on MSNBC or the shows that personify that. And that kind of segmentation, because there are so many different means through which we can get our information, I think has quite a polarizing effect, and it's compounded by the rise of the social networks, which allow you to then gather in these groups and again self-reinforce your views. So to your question, sir, we have a lot of work to do as a society to break those things down.
I wish we could take more questions, but we can't because we have to move on. I want to thank David and Jim for taking time from very, very busy schedules to talk about something I think that's so important to us, and quite honestly, I don't think is talked about enough. And so, bravo.
Thank you very much. Thank you.